I sat at my mahogany desk, fingers tracing the small brass nameplate that still read, Eleanor Montgomery, Executive Vice President. I'd kept it after retiring, a small trophy from 40 years in banking. My son Richard had no idea that I still owned controlling interest in Montgomery Financial, the very institution that held the mortgage on his lavish Westlake home. That fact didn't seem important until the day he told me I had become a financial burden and needed to find more modest accommodations. The morning light filtered through my study window, casting long shadows across the financial records I'd been reviewing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 42 years of disciplined investing had built a fortune few knew about. Certainly not my son, who assumed my pension was my only income. I preferred it that way. Money had a way of changing people, a lesson I'd learned watching clients. During my decades as a banker, I sipped my Earl Grey tea from the china cup James had given me on our 30th anniversary. He'd been gone for 5 years now. Eleanor, he used to say, a good banker never shows all their cards at once. James had built Montgomery Financial from nothing, then quietly transferred controlling interest to me before he passed. He knew Richard would expect to inherit everything simply because he was our only child. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. Its steady rhythm had kept me company since James died. I'd brought it with me when Richard insisted I move into his guest house last year after my hip surgery. It makes sense, Mom, he'd said with that confident smile he'd mastered in business school. You shouldn't be alone at your age, and this way we can keep an eye on you. I carefully organized my investment portfolios into their leather folder, utilities, technology, real estate, each section meticulously updated. Old banking habits die hard. The folder went into my safe, hidden behind a watercolor painting of our first home. Richard never asked about my finances. He simply assumed that at 72, I was living on a fixed income and Social Security. Morning. Eleanor, said Maria, Richard's housekeeper, as she delivered my breakfast tray. She was the only one who regularly checked on me. Mr. Richard and Ms. Vanessa left early for their tennis club. They said they'll be back for dinner. Thank you, dear, I replied, accepting the tray. Please tell them I may be late. I have some errands to run. After Maria left, I switched on my computer and logged into the Montgomery Financial Executive portal. Most of the board thought I maintained access purely for sentimental reasons. Only the CEO, Harrison Wells, my oldest friend and colleague, knew I still reviewed every major loan approval, including the recent vacation property my son had financed through our bank. The familiar faces of my past life smiled from silver frames arranged on my bookshelf. James in his chairman's office, my executive team at my retirement party, the opening of our 20th branch, a lifetime building something meaningful. In another frame, Richard graduated from business school, his arm around my shoulder, his father beaming proudly beside us. He has your business sense, James had whispered that day. And your ambition, I'd added, not yet understanding the difference between the two. The small television in the corner played softly, market updates and financial news. I kept it on out of habit, monitoring the economy even in retirement. Montgomery? Financial shares were up again. A small smile crossed my lips. Quarterly dividends would be announced next week. From my window, I could see the main house, a sprawling 6-bedroom Tudor that Richard had purchased 3 years ago. Too large for just him and Vanessa, but as he often reminded everyone, perception is reality in the luxury real estate business. His company, Montgomery Premier Properties, used the same family name, but operated independently from the bank. He'd insisted on that separation, wanting to make it on his own. The garden between the main house and my guest house bloomed with hydrangeas I'd planted last spring. Gardening had become my passion after retirement, creating something from nothing, nurturing growth, not unlike building a bank. I checked my watch. Harrison would be waiting for our monthly lunch. I changed into a simple navy dress, adding a strand of pearls and the gold watch James had given me on my 50th birthday. My wardrobe was deliberately understated. "Wealth whispers," James always said. Richard had never understood that philosophy, preferring Italian suits and German cars that announced his success to everyone he met. As I gathered my handbag, my phone chimed with a text message from Richard. "Need to talk tonight. Financial. Advisor suggested some changes regarding your living situation. Nothing urgent, but let's discuss over dinner. 7 p.m. A familiar weight settled in my chest. This wasn't the first such conversation. Last month, he'd suggested I simplify by selling my art collection, pieces James and I had carefully collected over decades. Before that, he'd proposed liquidating my investment portfolio to make things easier. I replied with a simple, "See you at 7, and slipped the phone into my bag. The drive to the Westlake Country Club took 15 minutes. I still maintained my membership, another fact that puzzled Richard. "Mom, you hardly ever use the facilities," he'd noted repeatedly. True, but the private dining room provided the perfect place to meet Harrison without raising questions. He was waiting at our usual table, distinguished in his tailored gray suit, a portfolio discreetly placed beside him. Harrison rose as I approached. "Eleanor," he said warmly, taking my hands in his. "You look wonderful." "Flatterer," I replied with a smile. "How's the bank?" "Thriving under your watchful eye, though the board still thinks you're just a sentimental figurehead." He pulled out my chair. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review." For the next hour, we discussed loan portfolios, market expansions, and strategic acquisitions. Few people would recognize the sharp-minded banker beneath my grandmotherly exterior, which was precisely how I preferred it. "And what about Richard's new loan application?" I asked eventually. "The vacation property in Aspen?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Approved yesterday. 5th property in his portfolio. The loan committee had concerns about his debt-to-income ratio, but everything passed underwriting." I nodded, making a mental note. "And the terms?" "Standard for high-value clients. Though between us, Eleanor, his business is over-leveraged. If the luxury market takes even a small downturn..." He let the sentence hang unfinished. "I know," I said quietly. "He takes after his father in ambition but not in caution." Our lunch concluded with personal matters. Harrison's grandchildren, my garden, our shared love of classical music. As always, he walked me to my car. "Eleanor," he said before I got in, "you know you could end this charade any time. The board would welcome you back officially." I smiled and patted his arm. "I prefer to observe from the shadows, old friend. Besides, Richard would be mortified to discover his mother still holds the purse strings." As I drove back to the guest house, I contemplated Richard's text message. Financial changes could only mean one thing: another attempt to access what he perceived as my limited resources. What he didn't know was that tonight's conversation would be different. After months of watching his financial decisions grow, increasingly reckless, I had made some decisions of my own. The guest house was quiet when I returned. I brewed another cup of tea and settled at my desk, reviewing Harrison's reports before the evening's confrontation. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, counting down the hours until everything would change. At precisely 6:45, I closed Harrison's financial reports and placed them in my safe. Dinner with Richard and Vanessa would begin in 15 minutes, and punctuality had always been non-negotiable in our family. I smoothed my dress and applied a touch of lipstick, armor for the conversation ahead. The walk to the main house was short but deliberate. Each step on the stone path between the hydrangeas reminded me of the day Richard had suggested I downsize from my home of 40 years to this guest house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It makes financial sense, he'd insisted. Property taxes are killing you, and the maintenance is too much at your age. I hadn't argued. Sometimes silence teaches more than words ever could. The kitchen door was unlocked as usual. The aroma of catered food, Richard and Vanessa never cooked, filled the air. Their housekeeper, Maria, nodded respectfully as I passed. "They're in the dining room, Mrs. Montgomery," she whispered. "Mr. Bennett is here too." Charles Bennett, Richard's financial advisor. My grip tightened on my handbag. So this wasn't just a family dinner. Richard stood when I entered, performing the gentlemanly gesture he reserved for clients and networking events. "Mom, right on time as always." Vanessa offered her customary air kiss, careful not to smudge her makeup. At 38, my daughter-in-law was beautiful in that polished way that required considerable maintenance. Diamond earrings caught the light as she moved, the ones Richard had purchased last month according to the bank's records. "Eleanor, wonderful to see you." Charles Bennett rose and extended his hand. I'd known Charles for 20 years. He'd started his career at Montgomery Financial before branching into private wealth management. He had no idea I still reviewed the bank's executive reports. "Charles," I nodded. "I wasn't expecting you this evening." A quick glance passed between him and Richard, the silent communication of men about to explain something complicated to a woman they presumed wouldn't understand. "Just thought it would be helpful to have Charles present for our discussion," Richard explained, gesturing toward my usual seat at the far end of the mahogany table. James's old seat, now Richard's by his own designation. Dinner proceeded with practiced pleasantries. Richard discussed his latest property acquisition in Aspen, carefully omitting the size of the mortgage he'd taken to purchase it. Vanessa detailed her charity committee work, emphasizing her new position as co-chair. I listened, asked appropriate questions, and waited for the real conversation to begin. It started, as these things often do, with a seemingly benign observation. "Mom, have you been getting out much lately? You seem a bit pale." Richard's concern sounded genuine, which made what followed more difficult to bear. "I'm fine," I replied. "The garden keeps me busy." "About that," he continued, setting down his fork. "Vanessa and I have been talking, and we think the guest house might be too much for you now." I raised an eyebrow. "Too much? It's barely 800 square feet." Charles cleared his throat. "What Richard means, Eleanor, is that maintaining your independence, while admirable, might not be the most financially prudent approach at this stage." "I see." I took a sip of water. "And what would be prudent, in your professional opinion?" Richard jumped in before Charles could answer. "We've found a wonderful retirement community, Oak Meadows. It's upscale, lots of activities, full-time medical staff. They have a beautiful one-bedroom unit available next month." The weight of what he was proposing settled between us. Not just moving me from the guest house, but removing me entirely from their property, their lives. "And the guest house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Vanessa smiled brilliantly. "We thought we'd convert it to a home office. Richard needs the space now that he's expanding the business, and it would save on commercial rent." "Of course. My living space was simply an untapped business asset in their eyes." "Oak Meadows requires a substantial entrance fee," I noted, having researched the facility myself years ago when considering options for an elderly client. This was where Charles Bennett leaned forward. "We've reviewed your finances, Eleanor. Between your pension, Social Security, and liquidating some of your remaining investments, we can make it work." "You've reviewed my finances?" I kept my voice level, though something cold settled in my chest. "I don't recall authorizing that." Richard had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "Mom, we're just trying to help. You know Dad left me as your financial proxy in case of emergency." "And is this an emergency, Richard?" "Well, no, but—" "What Richard means," Vanessa interjected smoothly, "is that we worry about you. Your generation isn't always comfortable discussing financial realities. My generation, as if I hadn't spent decades managing multi-million-dollar portfolios and approving loans larger than their combined net worth. The truth is, Richard continued, his tone shifting to what I recognized as his closing the deal voice, the market isn't what it used to be. Your pension only goes so far. We've run the numbers, and frankly, Mom, you're going to run out of money staying on your current path. I set down my napkin. And when exactly would that happen? Charles opened his portfolio. Based on our projections and your current expenditures, you have approximately 3 to 5 years before your resources are depleted. I see. I took a measured breath. And these projections are based on what information exactly? Your pension statements, property tax records, estimated living expenses, Charles replied. Richard provided what he could. What he could? What? He thought he knew. The entrance fee for Oak Meadows is $300,000, Richard stated flatly. We think selling your art collection and investment portfolio would cover it. I've already spoken to an appraiser about the Monet in your study. The Monet, a small original James had given me on our 25th anniversary. The painting that hung beside the safe containing documentation of my controlling interest in a regional banking institution with assets exceeding $2 billion. That's very thorough of you, I said carefully. When would you need my decision? Relief washed over Richard's face. He'd expected resistance, perhaps even tears. My apparent compliance was a pleasant surprise. The unit will be available June 1st. The sooner we can confirm, the better. 2 weeks. They were giving me 2 weeks to vacate my life. I'll need some time to consider this, I said, rising from the table. Thank you for dinner. Richard stood. Mom, I know this is a lot to take in, but it really is the best solution. You'll be comfortable, safe, and frankly, it takes the financial burden off everyone. The financial burden. 42 years in banking, and my son saw me as a liability on a balance sheet. I understand, I said, though I didn't. Not really. Not how the boy I'd raised could dismiss me so easily. I'll let you know my decision soon. As I walked back to the guest house, the evening air felt suddenly cold. The path seemed longer, the garden less vibrant. For the first time since James died, I felt truly alone. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, allowing myself a moment of genuine emotion before practicality reasserted itself. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, a reminder that time moved forward regardless of sentiment. I went to my study and moved the Monet aside, revealing the wall safe. Inside, alongside my financial records, was a sealed envelope James had given me before he died. Open it when Richard shows you who he really is, he'd said, not who you hope he is. I broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of notepaper in my husband's familiar handwriting. Eleanor, if you're reading this, our son has disappointed you as he did me. Remember what we built. Remember who built it. The time for sentiment has passed. With love and confidence, James, I refolded the letter and reached for my phone. Harrison answered on the second ring. Eleanor, is everything all right? Schedule a full board meeting, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Next Tuesday, it's time the shadow chairwoman steps back into the light. Are you sure? His concern was palpable. After all these years of privacy? Yes, I replied, looking at the small brass nameplate on my desk. And Harrison, don't alert Richard's division. This needs to be a surprise. After hanging up, I sat in the silence of my study. The journey ahead would be difficult, perhaps painful, but necessary. I'd spent years protecting Richard from consequences, both his father's disappointment and his own poor decisions. That protection ended tonight. Morning light filtered through the guest house windows as I prepared for the board meeting. I selected a charcoal Chanel suit I hadn't worn in years, classic, authoritative, with subtle pearl buttons that had been James's last gift to me. My appearance needed to convey the message before I spoke a single word. I was not the fragile elderly mother Richard believed me to be. The weekend had passed in careful preparation. Harrison had arranged everything discreetly, scheduling the emergency board meeting under the pretext of discussing a significant acquisition opportunity. As controlling shareholder, my presence would raise no suspicions until I arrived. Maria knocked softly as I finished my coffee. "Mrs. Montgomery?" Mr. Richard asked if you'd join them for breakfast. He says he has some brochures from Oak Meadows to show you. Please tell him I have an appointment this morning. Perhaps dinner instead. After she left, I gathered the documents Harrison had delivered yesterday. Executive summaries of Richard's loan portfolio, copies of board minutes from meetings I had missed, and the updated shareholder registry that still listed me as controlling interest under my maiden name, Eleanor Sinclair. A strategy James had implemented decades ago to protect the family's privacy. The drive to Montgomery Financial headquarters brought a rush of memories. I had personally selected the location for our flagship branch 30 years ago, overseeing every detail of its construction. The 12-story building of glass and stone still dominated the downtown skyline, our name displayed prominently at the top. I parked in the chairperson's reserved space, empty since James's death, and used my private elevator key. Few employees would recognize me now. Banking was a young person's game these days, with most of my contemporaries long retired. Harrison waited in the executive boardroom, along with Patricia Liu, our general counsel. Her surprised expression confirmed that Harrison had maintained my requested secrecy. "Eleanor," Patricia recovered quickly, extending her hand. "This is unexpected. Harrison mentioned a special guest, but it's good to see you, Patricia. It's been too long." The boardroom remained essentially unchanged. The same 20-foot mahogany table, the same leather chairs, even the same oil painting of the original Montgomery Financial location that James had commissioned for our 10th anniversary. Only the faces around the table would be different. "The board members are gathering in the reception area," Harrison explained. "I've instructed security to keep Richard's access card deactivated until 10:15. The meeting begins at 10 Perfect." I set my portfolio on the table at the head position, James's old seat, mine by right, though I had never claimed it. "And the quarterly reports?" "Distributed yesterday. Everything is ready." At precisely 10 Mound, Harrison opened the boardroom doors. 8 people entered, their conversations halting abruptly when they saw me. I recognized only 3. The rest were appointments made after my official retirement. "Good morning," I said, remaining seated as they found their places. "For those who don't know me, I'm Eleanor Montgomery." A young man in his 30s, wearing a suit too expensive for his position, leaned toward Patricia. "I thought Mrs. Montgomery was retired. Is this a ceremonial appearance?" Before Patricia could respond, I opened my portfolio. "This is not ceremonial, Mr. Lawson. As controlling shareholder of Montgomery Financial, I've called this meeting to address several concerns regarding our current lending practices." The room fell silent. Harrison suppressed a smile as he took his seat to my right. "Controlling shareholder?" Another board member, Diane Reynolds if I recalled correctly, looked confused. I was under the impression the Montgomery family shares were distributed among the board after James's death. "A common misconception," I replied. "One I've allowed to persist for business reasons. Now, shall we begin?" The next 30 minutes consisted of standard quarterly review, asset performance, market position, risk assessments. I asked pointed questions about loan approval protocols, particularly for high-value residential properties. The board members gradually relaxed, perhaps assuming my presence was merely an old woman's nostalgia project. At 10:35, precisely as planned, the boardroom door opened. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, briefcase in hand, expression shifting, from confusion to shock. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I gestured to an empty chair. Richard, please join us. We were just discussing the bank's exposure in the luxury real estate market. He entered slowly, calculating scenarios, adjusting his approach with each step. I had watched him do this countless times in business settings. Adapt, recalibrate, find advantage. It was a skill James had taught him, one he had mastered perhaps too well. I wasn't aware you were attending today, he said carefully, taking the offered seat. The security desk seemed confused about my access card. An oversight, I replied. Now, perhaps you can share your perspective on our current lending policies, particularly for properties exceeding $2 million. Richard's expression shifted to the confident smile he used with clients, warm, reassuring, completely manufactured. Of course, as you know, Montgomery Financial has always maintained conservative lending practices, even in the luxury segment. Conservative? I opened a folder containing his loan records. According to our portfolio analysis, luxury residential approvals have increased 47% under your division's management, while average down payment requirements have decreased from 30% to 18%. The kit? Board members exchanged glances. This level of specific criticism wasn't standard practice in open meetings. Richard's smile remained fixed, though his eyes hardened. The market has evolved, Mom. Our competitors offer similar terms. We'd lose business maintaining outdated requirements. Interesting. Perspective. I turned to the board. Would anyone like to guess what percentage of these luxury loans are currently in technical default on payment schedules? Before anyone could answer, Patricia interjected. Eleanor, perhaps these details would be better addressed in the risk committee rather than the full board meeting. Normally, yes, I agreed. However, when 43% of those technically defaulted loans belong to a single borrower, I believe it warrants full board attention. The room grew tense. Richard's smile disappeared entirely. And who is this borrower? Asked one of the newer board members. I met Richard's gaze directly. Montgomery Premier Properties, my son's company. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's face flushed, then paled. This is inappropriate, he finally said, voice tight. My business dealings are conducted through proper channels, with full disclosure of related party transactions. Full disclosure? I removed another document from my portfolio. Your most recent loan application for the Aspen property failed to disclose your existing payment delinquencies on 3 other properties. The application was fast-tracked through your department and approved with minimal review. Harrison distributed copies of the loan documentation to each board member. We've highlighted the relevant sections for your convenience. Richard leaned forward, abandoning pretense. Mom, what are you doing? Whatever point you're trying to make? The point, Richard, is governance. This institution has standards that apply to everyone, family included. Your father built this bank on that principle. His expression darkened. Dad's been gone 5 years. Banking has changed. Perhaps, I conceded. But ethics haven't. Now, I propose we recess for 15 minutes. When we return, we'll discuss the restructuring of Montgomery Financial's luxury lending division. As the board members filed out, Richard remained seated, waiting until we were alone. Is this about the retirement community? He asked, voice low. Because if you're trying to prove something, this isn't about Oak Meadows, Richard. I closed my portfolio. This is about consequences. Something you've rarely experienced. He leaned back, reassessing me as if seeing a stranger. I didn't realize you still had shares in the bank, Dad told me. Your father told you what you needed to know at the time. He hoped you would earn the rest. And you've been what? Spying on my business? Tracking my loans? For how long? Since the beginning, I replied simply. James transferred, controlling interest to me before he died. He knew you weren't ready. The realization hit him visibly, years of assumptions crumbling in an instant. Not just about the bank, but about me. The mother he thought he knew, the inheritance he believed was his by right. "So this morning's breakfast invitation?" I asked. "Those Oak Meadows brochures? Were they meant to convince me I couldn't afford to live independently anymore?" He had the decency to look away. "Your finances are none of your concern," I finished for him. "Never have been." Harrison appeared at the door. "The board is ready to reconvene, Eleanor." I stood, smoothing my suit jacket. "We should join them." Richard remained seated. "And if I don't agree to this restructuring? If I fight this?" I paused at the door, suddenly feeling every year of my age, every disappointment. "Then you'll lose, Richard. Not just your position, but your properties as well. Those loans you've been deferring payments on, they're now under review." As I walked back to the boardroom, I heard him following slowly behind me. The false welcome was over. Now came the reckoning. The board meeting's aftermath unfolded predictably. Richard was placed under review, with Harrison appointed interim director of his division. His loan portfolio was frozen pending audit, with mandatory restructuring of his personal debt. I spent the afternoon with my attorney, updating my will and trust documents. When I returned to the guest house, Vanessa was waiting inside. "Eleanor," she stood as I entered. "Richard told me about the board meeting." I assumed he would. She moved around my living room nervously, touching objects as if seeing them for the first time. "These are lovely pieces. I never really noticed them before." "Thank you." I sat, waiting. Vanessa never visited without an agenda. "Richard is upset," she finally said. "He feels blindsided." "Understandable. He says you control the bank, that you've been monitoring his loans." Her voice carried accusation. "That you could have helped with our expansion plans any time, but chose not to." I studied her designer dress, diamond earrings, the tennis bracelet on her wrist. "Richard has received considerably more help than most." "But not your full support," she pressed. "Not your connections, your influence? No. Those must be earned. Eleanor, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Richard adores you. Everything, the guest house, even suggesting Oak Meadows, was out of concern for your comfort. Was it concern that led him to appraise my belongings without permission? To declare me financially insolvent without reviewing my actual accounts? He was trying to help. Perhaps overzealous, but with good intentions." "Intentions," I repeated softly. James used to say banking was never about intentions, only actions and consequences. Vanessa's expression hardened slightly. "Richard mentioned, you've been emotional since James passed, that sometimes you imagine conversations with him. The implied diagnosis hung between us. Cognitive decline, a narrative they'd likely been constructing, preparing for resistance to their retirement community plans." "How convenient," I remarked. "An elderly widow, possibly confused, best managed by her concerned son." "No one is suggesting, whose idea was it to review my finances without my knowledge? To liquidate my art collection? To determine I couldn't afford independence?" She looked uncomfortable. "We were concerned, that's all. About my well-being or about the guest house you want for a home office?" She flushed. "That's unfair." I removed a folder from my briefcase. "This is my actual financial statement, not Charles's estimation based on Richard's assumptions." Her eyes widened as she scanned the document. "This can't be right. These investment accounts, the property holdings, all verified and current." I confirmed. "I'm quite capable of maintaining independence." Vanessa reassessed me visibly, the mental recalibration apparent as power dynamics suddenly inverted. "Does Richard know about this?" "He knows about the bank. The rest, I imagine, you'll share promptly." She stood to leave. I should go. "One more thing. The guest house renovations won't be necessary. I won't be leaving. Not for Oak Meadows, not for any arrangement you devise." But, Richard said after this morning, surely you wouldn't want— What I want, I interrupted gently, is respect. Not the performance of respect, but the genuine article. Something in short supply lately. Morning arrived with unusual silence. No text from Richard, no appearance from Vanessa, not even Maria with her customary breakfast tray. The main house stood quiet, shades still drawn despite the late hour. I used the solitude to prepare for the day ahead, reviewing documents Harrison had couriered over, loan restructuring proposals for Richard's properties, procedural updates for the luxury lending division, and the minutes from yesterday's board meeting. At precisely 10:30, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Montgomery Premier Properties. "Hello, Richard," I answered, keeping my voice neutral. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Not over the phone, in person." "I'm listening." "Dinner, tonight, 7 o'clock. His tone was clipped, controlled. "I've asked Charles Bennett to join us." I paused, considering the implications. "May I ask why your financial advisor needs to be present for a family discussion?" "This isn't just family anymore, Mom. You've made that abundantly clear." The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down slowly, noting the slight tremor in my hands. Not fear, but anticipation. The board meeting had been the opening move. Tonight would be Richard's counter. I spent the afternoon at Montgomery Financial's headquarters, meeting with the executive team to review the proposed changes to our lending protocols. The familiar work steadied me, the complex problem-solving a welcome distraction. By 5 o'clock, I had approved the new guidelines, authorized a full audit of our luxury portfolio, and drafted a shareholder statement explaining the operational adjustments. "Will Richard accept these terms?" Patricia asked as we concluded the meeting. Her legal mind always anticipated challenges. "He has little choice," Harrison replied. "The alternative is foreclosure on multiple properties. And if he leverages his position as Eleanor's son, claims undue hardship or family discord, I closed my portfolio with finality. Then he'll discover that banking and sentiment occupy separate compartments. James taught us both that lesson. Richard simply chose to forget it. The drive home felt longer than usual. As I approached the estate gates, I noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway, a black Lincoln Continental with government plates. Curious. Maria met me at the kitchen door, her expression anxious. "Mrs. Montgomery, Mr. Richard has guests in the main house. He asked that you join them in the dining room when you arrive." "Guests, plural?" "I thought only Charles Bennett would be joining us." She nodded. "Mr. Bennett is here, yes. Also a man in a suit. I didn't catch his name." I thanked her and made my way through the kitchen toward the dining room. Voices drifted from behind the closed door. Richard's, tense and insistent. Another man's, measured and authoritative. I caught fragments only: fiduciary responsibility and regulatory concerns. I straightened my jacket and opened the door without knocking. 3 men turned toward me, Richard standing near the window. Charles Bennett, seated at the table with documents spread before him. The third, a stranger in his late 50s wearing a government identification badge, Thomas Hargrove, Federal Banking Commission. "Mom," Richard stepped forward. "Thank you for joining us. We were just discussing some concerns about Montgomery Financial's governance structure." I remained in the doorway, assessing the situation. Federal Banking Commission concerns, apparently. How unusual to address them in a private residence rather than corporate headquarters. Hargrove stood, extending his hand. "Mrs. Montgomery, I apologize for the unorthodox setting. Your son indicated you preferred discretion in family business matters. Did he?" I shook his hand briefly. "How considerate. And what specific concerns bring a federal regulator to my son's dining room?" Charles Bennett cleared his throat. "Perhaps you should sit, Eleanor. This is a rather delicate situation. I took a seat at the opposite end of the table from Hargrove, maintaining direct eye contact. I'm listening. Richard remained standing, positioning himself between us like a mediator, a role he had clearly assigned himself. Mr. Hargrove is conducting a preliminary inquiry into potential conflicts of interest at Montgomery Financial. Specifically, Hargrove elaborated, concerns about undisclosed controlling interests and preferential lending practices. I nodded slowly, the strategy becoming transparent. Raised by whom, if I may ask? Anonymous whistleblower, he replied, though his eyes flicked briefly toward Richard. Standard procedure requires we investigate all credible reports of regulatory violations. Of course, I said calmly. And the specific violations alleged? Hargrove opened a folder. First, failure to disclose beneficial ownership, specifically your controlling interest in Montgomery Financial, which appears to have been deliberately obscured through the use of your maiden name on shareholder registries. A privacy measure implemented by my late husband, I corrected, fully documented in the bank's legal filings and disclosed to previous regulatory reviews. His eyebrows rose slightly. Second concern, apparent conflict of interest regarding your son's loans. Your position was not disclosed on related party transaction filings. Because until yesterday, I maintained no operational role in the bank, I explained. My shares were passive investments managed through a blind trust structure, again fully documented in regulatory filings. Richard interjected, his voice carrying forced concern. Mom, the issue is the sudden change, your unexpected assertion, of control coinciding with actions against my loans. Mr. Hargrove is concerned it might appear retaliatory. And there it was, the calculated move. Paint my actions as emotional, vindictive, inappropriate. Position himself as the reasonable, party seeking proper oversight. The federal regulator was likely legitimate, the concerns manufactured or exaggerated to create leverage. Mr. Hargrove, I said, turning away from Richard, I assume you've reviewed Montgomery Financial's lending portfolio analysis from the past 5 years? Not in detail, no. This is a preliminary. Then perhaps you should, I interrupted, opening my briefcase and removing a thumb drive. This contains the complete audit trail of every luxury property loan approved under my son's division. You'll note the systematic deviation from stated lending protocols, the pattern of deferred payment accommodations, and the concentration of high-risk approvals to related parties. Hargrove accepted the drive with professional caution. You came prepared. Banking regulation has been my professional focus for 40 years, Mr. Hargrove. Nothing occurring at Montgomery Financial happens without documentation, including this impromptu investigation. Charles Bennett shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor, Richard is simply trying to ensure proper procedures are followed. With your sudden return to active management, after being declared financially incompetent and pressured to surrender my independence, I finished for him. Yes, I imagine proper procedures feel particularly important now. Richard's composure slipped momentarily. That's not fair. We were concerned about your well-being. Were you? I turned to face him fully. Then why did you misrepresent my financial status to Charles? Why attempt to liquidate my assets without consultation? Why present a retirement community as my only viable option? You believed what suited your purposes, I cut in, just as you're attempting to do now. Silence settled over the room. Hargrove looked between us, reassessing the situation. Charles Bennett studied his papers with sudden intense interest. Richard moved to the sideboard and poured himself a drink, his back to us. When he turned, his expression had hardened into something I barely recognized. Let's stop pretending, he said. All pretense abandoned. You blindsided me at the board meeting, humiliated me in front of my colleagues, threatened my business, my properties, my reputation. I enforced the lending standards your father established, I corrected, Standards you've systematically circumvented. Dad's standards were from another era. The controlled facade cracked completely. The market changed, banking changed, but you and Harrison, clutching your outdated principles that prevented Montgomery Financial from collapse during 2 recessions, I interrupted. Principles that built your inheritance. An inheritance you've apparently decided to withhold. And there it was, the moment of truth behind all the maneuvering, Richard's fundamental belief that everything built by his parents belonged rightfully to him, regardless of merit or readiness. The bank was never your inheritance, I said quietly. It was your opportunity, one you needed to earn. His laugh was sharp, humorless. Earn? I've worked there 15 years, built the luxury division from nothing, generated millions in fees and interest. While accumulating personal loans you routinely defer paying, I countered, while using your position to approve financing for business associates without proper vetting, while treating the institution your father built as your personal resource. Richard set his glass down with controlled precision. Is that what this is about? Some misguided loyalty to Dad's memory? Punishing me because I'm not the banker he was? This isn't punishment, Richard. It's consequence. Consequences? His voice rose. I'm facing foreclosure on 3 properties because of your vendetta, potentially losing my division at the bank. And for what? Because I suggested you move to a retirement community that matches your circumstances? I looked at him. Steadily, this son I'd raised, this man I barely recognized. My circumstances, I repeated. Remind me. What exactly did you believe those circumstances to be? A destitute widow? A financially incompetent elderly mother? A burden to be managed? The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. You never asked, Richard. Not once. You never inquired about my finances, my wishes, my plans. You assumed, decided, arranged. And when I failed to comply, you manufactured a regulatory inquiry to pressure me back into silence. Richard glanced at Hargrove, who was observing our exchange with increasing discomfort. I think, the regulator said carefully, that I should review these materials at my office. This appears to be a family matter complicated by business concerns, rather than a regulatory issue. A prudent decision, I agreed, rising from my chair. Montgomery Financial's compliance team will make themselves available for any follow-up questions. As Hargrove gathered his materials, Richard stood motionless, jaw tight, watching his leverage evaporate. The careful strategy, the federal regulator, the conflict of interest allegations, collapsing under the weight of documented facts. Charles, I addressed the financial advisor, who seemed eager to disappear entirely. I believe your services in this matter are no longer required. Bennett nodded quickly, collecting his papers. Of course. I'll see myself out. When they had gone, only Richard and I remained in the large dining room, the space between us filled with decades of assumptions and misunderstandings. What happens? Now? He finally asked, voice stripped of its usual confidence. I gathered my briefcase. Now you decide who you want to be. A banker worthy of your father's legacy, or a borrower facing foreclosure. The choice, as it has always been, is yours. As I walked toward the door, he called after me. And what about us? As family? I paused, hand on the doorframe. That's a separate question entirely, and one that will take much longer to answer. Back in the guest house, I watched through the window as Hargrove's car pulled away, followed shortly by Bennett's. The dining room lights in the main house remained on, a solitary figure visible through the curtains. Richard, still standing where I'd left him. The moment of truth had passed. What remained was the long road of consequence for both of us. The morning after confronting Richard, I found a formal letter under my door, Montgomery Premier Properties letterhead, his signature. The coldly professional notice requested I vacate the guest house within 30 days, citing property requirements, for business expansion. Legal language to mask a son's retaliation against his mother, Harrison called as I prepared breakfast. Richards called an emergency meeting with the lending committee. He's bringing Westfield and Associates. Corporate restructuring specialists, I noted, recognizing the name. Westfield specialized in hostile takeovers and shareholder disputes. Richard was escalating from family disagreement to corporate warfare. My reflection was interrupted by a soft knock. Maria stood awkwardly at the door, a small suitcase beside her. "Mrs. Montgomery, I've been dismissed. Mr. Richards says the household staffing is being restructured." Another calculated move, isolating me, removing potential allies. Maria had worked for them for 8 years. Her dismissal was both punitive and strategic. "Do you have somewhere to go?" I asked. She nodded. "My sister's place. I'll be fine, but I'm worried about you, alone here." "I won't be staying much longer either," I assured her. "You're moving to that retirement place?" "No," I smiled. "I'm reclaiming some independence." After Maria left, I called Elizabeth Warner, my oldest friend and former colleague, the first female senior vice president in Montgomery Financial's history. "Eleanor, darling, Harrison called me yesterday. Quite the dramatic return you've made. Not by choice, but necessary. Sounds like your son inherited James's ambition, but not his ethics." Elizabeth never minced words. "You need a place to stay. The pool house is yours for as long as you need it. Martin and I are leaving for Europe next week anyway." Elizabeth's estate, a historic mansion in Wellington Heights with 10 acres of landscaped gardens, had been her reward for decades of corporate success. The pool house was actually a fully appointed 3-bedroom cottage with its own gardens. "James would be proud of you," she added, "standing your ground like this. He always said you were the backbone of everything he built." I began packing methodically. Clothing, personal papers, photographs, James's favorite books, my mother's. Pearls, the brass nameplate from my desk. Small pieces of a life carefully constructed, now being deliberately dismantled. I was wrapping china teacups when I heard the front door open without a knock. Someone entering with the presumption of ownership. Vanessa stood in the living room, surveying the half-packed boxes with cool detachment. "So you're actually leaving," she observed, as requested, though not to Oak Meadows. "Richard is upset, more than I've ever seen him." Understandable. Professional. Consequences can be distressing when unexpected. "This isn't just professional," she countered. "This is family. You're his mother." A fact that didn't seem particularly relevant when discussing my financial incompetence or planning my removal to a retirement facility. Vanessa sighed. "Things got out of hand. We were trying to help." "Were you? Or were you trying to expand your office space while eliminating an inconvenient elderly relative?" Her silence was answer enough. "What hurts most isn't the dismissal of my capabilities. It's that neither of you ever asked what I wanted, what I needed." I resumed packing. 40 years in banking, managing billions in assets, and my son believes I can't manage my own finances. It wasn't personal, Eleanor. It was practical. Her facade slipped. "This property is worth considerably more than Richard paid for it. When the market turns, we need to be positioned for maximum leverage. So I was reduced to a line item in your investment strategy." She changed tactics. "Richard's meeting with lawyers today. He says there are ways to challenge your control of the bank. A warning then, or perhaps a negotiating position." "He's welcome to try," I replied calmly, "though it would be cheaper to simply pay his loans on schedule." "That's not possible right now." Her admission came reluctantly. The Aspen property was supposed to be the cornerstone of our expansion. Without that financing, understanding dawned. "You're overextended. The loans, the delayed payments. It's not just business strategy. You're in financial trouble." She didn't deny it. "Richard says it's temporary. Once the new listings sell, if they sell, I corrected. In a tightening luxury market with rising interest rates. We've survived downturns before. With help, I noted. Help you now assume will not be forthcoming. Is that what this is? Punishment because we suggested you downsize? This is consequence, Vanessa. Richard extended himself beyond prudent. Limits? Assuming safety nets would materialize when needed. Safety nets like his mother's inheritance, she stated bluntly. Assets he simply assumed would be available when convenient, without effort or merit on his part. Vanessa moved toward the door. I should go. Richard will be home soon. Before, you leave! I've accepted Elizabeth Warner's invitation to stay at her pool house while I secure permanent arrangements. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Elizabeth Warner? From the Centennial Trust Board? The same. I didn't elaborate on Elizabeth's extensive connections, her influence in banking circles, her friendship with Federal Reserve governors. I see. Vanessa. Recalculated visibly. When will you leave? Tomorrow. Should I tell Richard about Elizabeth? If you think it relevant. After she left, my phone chimed with a text from Harrison. Richard's meeting postponed. Westfield requested additional documentation of share structure, buying us time. Time, the one resource that couldn't be borrowed against or recovered once, spent. I had given Richard years of patience, decades of support. Now I was reclaiming what remained for myself. Tomorrow I would leave this false sanctuary for Elizabeth's pool house, surrounded by genuine support rather than conditional tolerance. From there, I would map my next moves with the deliberate precision that had guided my banking career. Richard had declared war, financial, legal, familial. He would soon discover that while he might have learned ambition from his father, I had learned strategy. The teacups, wrapped and boxed, would come with me. Family heirlooms, like legacy and respect, belonged with those who valued them properly. Elizabeth Warner's estate embodied old money tranquility, 12 acres of manicured gardens surrounding a historic Georgian mansion that had once belonged to a railroad magnate. The pool house, despite its modest name, was a charming 3-bedroom cottage with its own garden and a view of the tennis courts. It's not exactly roughing it, Elizabeth remarked as she showed me around. At 74, she remained impeccably elegant. Silver hair in a perfect chignon, posture that ballet dancers would envy, voice still carrying the faint British accent from her London childhood. It's perfect, I assured her, setting down a box of books in the sunlit living room. And temporary. Stay as long as you need. She waved dismissively. Martin and I will be in Europe until September. The staff know to treat you as they would. Us, staff. The word reminded me how different our retirements had been. Elizabeth embracing her wealth openly, me concealing mine even from family. James had encouraged my discretion, believing it protected both the bank and Richard from unwanted scrutiny. In retrospect, it had merely enabled misconceptions. Harrison tells me Richard has engaged Westfield, Elizabeth said, settling into an armchair. Aggressive move. Desperate one, I corrected. His lending portfolio is overextended. The bank's restructuring requirements will force several property sales, possibly at a loss. She studied me over her reading glasses. And you're prepared for what comes next? Westfield doesn't retreat easily. Neither do I. I unpacked a silver frame containing a photograph of James on our 40th anniversary. I've authorized Patricia to implement the dormant shareholder provisions if necessary. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. The nuclear option. James always was thorough in his contingency planning. The dormant shareholder provisions had been James's creation, legal structures that could, if activated, effectively lock down Montgomery Financial's governance for up to 2 years in the event of contested control. We had established them during a period of aggressive bank consolidations, protection against hostile takeovers. I never imagined using them against our son. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, I said, placing James's photograph on the mantel. Elizabeth's housekeeper appeared with a tea tray, providing a welcome interruption. As we sipped Earl Grey from hand-painted porcelain cups, Elizabeth shared news of mutual acquaintances, art exhibitions she planned to visit in Paris, her granddaughter's recent graduation from law school. Normal conversation, everyday topics. A reminder that life continued despite family ruptures. After she left to prepare for her trip, I spent the afternoon unpacking and organizing my temporary home. The cottage felt peaceful, removed from tension. In the garden, hydrangeas similar to those I'd planted at Richard's guest house bloomed in shades of blue and purple. I deadheaded spent blossoms automatically, gardening habits persisting despite displacement. My phone chimed with messages throughout the day. Harrison updating me on bank operations, my attorney confirming filing of residency change documents, a formal notice from Montgomery Financial regarding my loan portfolio review committee meeting scheduled for Monday. Business as usual, conducted through proper channels, creating paper, trails for whatever confrontations lay ahead. But nothing from Richard. No acknowledgement of my departure. No reaction to my relocation to Elizabeth Warner's estate. A move that would undoubtedly concern him given her influence in banking circles. At par. Sunset. I sat on the cottage's stone patio, watching gold and crimson light play across the formal gardens. The estate's security system hummed discreetly, motion sensors and cameras maintaining vigilant watch. Elizabeth had always prioritized protection, another habit from our banking days when threats occasionally materialized from rejected loan applicants or disgruntled employees. I was reviewing loan documents when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number with the bank's office exchange. Eleanor Montgomery, I answered. Mrs. Montgomery, this is Diane Chen from Records Management at Montgomery Financial. A young woman's voice, professional but hesitant. I'm calling because, well, there's been an unusual request I thought you should know about. I set aside my papers. What kind of request, Ms. Chen? Someone's been accessing the archived executive files from the chairman's office, specifically the records from 2008 through 2010. The transition period after Mr. Montgomery's stroke, before his recovery, my attention sharpened. Those years had been challenging. James temporarily incapacitated, leadership divided among senior executives, difficult decisions made during the financial crisis. Who made this request? That's why I'm calling. It came through Mr. Richards' office, but using your former executive authorization codes that shouldn't be active anymore. A chill settled in my chest. Thank you for alerting me, Ms. Chen. Please restrict access to those archives immediately, under my direct authority as controlling shareholder, and please forward me a list of exactly which files were accessed. After ending the call, I sat motionless, processing the implications. Richard was searching for leverage, specifically from the period when James was vulnerable and I had made difficult decisions to protect the bank. Decisions that, taken out of context or viewed through a hostile lens, might be portrayed as self-serving or improper. I dialed Harrison immediately. He's looking for ammunition, I explained after relating Chen's call, probably hoping to find evidence of improper conduct during James's illness. Harrison's response was measured. Those were extraordinary times. Eleanor, we all made tough calls. Legal calls, I emphasized. Ethical calls, but potentially controversial without proper context. I'll alert Patricia to prepare defensive documentation. Anything specific you're concerned about? I considered the question carefully. The Westlake acquisition. The board was divided. James would have voted against it, but I pushed it through while he was incapacitated. Because our analysts confirmed it was undervalued and strategically critical, Harrison reminded me. Time proved you right. It's now one of our most profitable divisions. Context matters less than perception in these situations, I replied. Richard is building a narrative, the controlling wife who seized power during her husband's illness, The mother who undermined her son's business. The widow who hoarded wealth that should have transferred to the next generation. Fiction, Harrison scoffed. Effective fiction, I corrected, particularly if supported by selectively presented documents. After ending the call, I unlocked my tablet and accessed my personal cloud storage, a digital archive James had insisted I maintain separate from bank systems. Here I had preserved the complete record of our professional lives, including correspondence, meeting notes, and decision rationales that didn't appear in official minutes. I located the Westlake acquisition folder and began reviewing documents from that tumultuous period. James's early objections, the valuation analyses that changed our perspective, the physician's statement confirming James's temporary incapacity, the board's eventual consensus approval once the strategic advantages became clear. The complete narrative, not the selective version Richard would undoubtedly construct. I worked through the night, methodically reviewing potential vulnerability points from those difficult years. By dawn, I had compiled a comprehensive defensive file, every controversial decision properly contextualized, every apparent overstep explained by the extraordinary circumstances of the financial crisis and James's health challenges. As morning light filtered through the cottage windows, I made one final call to Marcus Delaney, former Montgomery Financial board member and now Securities Exchange Commission senior counsel. Eleanor, his familiar baritone warmed the line. Elizabeth said you might reach out. Trouble with Richard? Potential governance dispute, I clarified. I'm hoping to contain it before regulatory involvement becomes necessary, but I wanted to give you advance notice. There may be accusations regarding decisions made during James's illness. Marcus had been a steadfast ally during that period, supporting my temporary leadership while others wavered. Send me whatever documentation you have. I'll review it from a regulatory perspective, identify any potential issues before they're weaponized. I appreciate that, Marcus. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. If Richard's involving Westfield, this could get ugly fast. Family disputes usually do, especially with significant assets involved. After ending the call, I stood by the cottage window, watching gardeners tend Elizabeth's immaculate roses. The irony wasn't lost on me. After decades of careful financial management, after building Montgomery Financial into a regional powerhouse, I was now marshaling resources to defend against my own son's attacks. My phone chimed with a message. From Patricia. Richard canceled Monday's loan committee meeting, requested 2-week extension on restructuring terms, citing family considerations. Buying time. Indeed he was. Time to build his case, gather allies, prepare his assault on Bao's, my control of the bank. Time I would use equally strategically. I poured a cup of tea and opened my laptop, creating a new document titled Contingency Planning. The banker in me, the executive who had navigated financial crises and market collapses, approached the situation methodically. If Richard wanted war rather than reconciliation, I would be prepared for every potential maneuver. Under assets, I listed my resources: financial, legal, and relational. Controlling bank shares, documentation of Richard's loan delinquencies, strategic allies like Harrison, Patricia, Elizabeth, and Marcus, my reputation in banking circles, my deep knowledge of Montgomery Financial's operations. Under liabilities, I acknowledged my vulnerabilities: age perception, emotional attachment, reluctance to publicly humiliate my son, the appearance of vindictiveness if I enforced loan terms too aggressively, the risk to the bank's reputation if our dispute became public. Finally, under strategy, I outlined my approach: defensive documentation, preemptive regulatory consultation, quiet reinforcement of board support, patience rather than escalation, firm enforcement of standards rather than punitive action. The path ahead was clear: not as a vindictive mother, but as a responsible banking executive protecting an institution from improper influence and financial mismanagement. The fact that the source of that improper influence was my son added emotional complexity, but didn't change the fundamental principles at stake. I closed the laptop and picked up James's photograph from the mantel. "You always said he'd test us." "Eventually," I told the silver-framed image. "I just never imagined how thoroughly." My phone rang again. The main switchboard at Montgomery Financial. "Mrs. Montgomery, this is security. There's been an access attempt to your former office using outdated credentials. Protocol requires immediate notification to the account holder." My former office, maintained as a courtesy but unused since retirement. "When did this occur?" "Approximately 20 minutes ago. Access was denied per system upgrades, but we have it flagged in the security log." "Thank you. Please forward the complete log to my secure email." After hanging up, I stared at the phone thoughtfully. Richard was growing desperate, attempting to access physical files now that digital archives had been restricted. His strategy was becoming clear. Find something, anything, that could be used to challenge my competence, my integrity, or my right to control Montgomery Financial. What he failed to understand was that I had spent 40 years preparing for challenges to my authority in a male-dominated industry. I had documentation for every decision, witnesses for every meeting, rationales for every unconventional move. My apparent retirement had never meant surrender of information or influence, merely a strategic repositioning. I sent a brief message to Harrison. "Office access attempt. Implement Protocol 17. Protocol 17, another of James's contingency measures. This one designed to protect sensitive information during leadership transitions. All executive files would now require dual authentication for access, with automatic notification to both Harrison and me for any retrieval attempts. The resources Richard sought to use against me had already been secured, protected by systems his father had created and I had maintained. Hidden resources like my financial assets, like my banking expertise, like my network of loyal colleagues, all preserved quietly over decades, available when needed. I returned to the garden, clipping, spent hydrangea blooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that maintenance required regular attention. Some things couldn't be neglected without consequence. Gardens, banking institutions, family relationships. Richard was about to discover just how thoroughly his mother had tended all three. Elizabeth's pool house offered more than sanctuary. It provided perspective. From this peaceful distance, I could analyze my situation with banker's precision rather than a mother's emotion. 3 days after leaving Richard's property, I convened what Elizabeth jokingly called my war council in her sunroom. Harrison arrived first, followed by Patricia Liu, Montgomery Financial's general counsel, and Marcus Delaney from the SEC. "Richard's building a case," Harrison reported, passing folders to each of us. "Not just for bank control, but potential regulatory action against decisions made during James's illness." Patricia nodded grimly. "Westfield's strategy is clear. Create enough uncertainty about governance to force negotiation. They've requested 15 years of board minutes." I opened the first folder, containing Richard's loan documentation. "And his financial position?" "Worse than we thought," Harrison replied. "The Aspen property was leveraged at 85% valuation. 3 other properties are technically underwater after recent market corrections. He's gambling on market recovery," Marcus observed. "Common during the last boom, less advisable now. And increasingly desperate," Patricia added. "His mortgage payments on all properties total nearly $48,000 monthly. Without the Aspen approval, cash flow projections show insolvency within 6 months." The implications were clear. Richard wasn't simply challenging my authority from wounded pride. He was fighting for financial survival. "What's our exposure if this becomes public?" I asked. Patricia straightened her glasses. Montgomery Financial's reputation could suffer if a controlling shareholder dispute reaches the financial press. Depositor confidence might waver. And Richard knows this, Harrison concluded. It's leverage. I considered our options carefully. Emotional responses, either capitulation or aggression, would damage the institution James and I had built. Strategic preparation was essential. We'll implement a three-part approach, I decided. First, financial containment. Restructure Richard's loans under standard protocols, neither punitive nor preferential. Second, governance reinforcement. Document every decision with supporting analysis and precedent. Third, relationship management. Maintain professional communication channels without escalation. Marcus nodded approval. Methodical, defensible. And if Richard rejects the loan restructuring? Harrison asked. Then normal collection procedures apply, I replied evenly. Without exception. After they departed, I remained in the sunroom, watching hummingbirds dance around Elizabeth's feeders. The afternoon light caught my wedding ring, platinum with a sapphire instead of diamond, because James had known I preferred practicality to flash. That understanding had built our partnership, our bank, our life together. What Richard failed to comprehend was that my actions weren't retaliation for his attempt to displace me. They were the necessary consequence of poor financial judgment, the same standards I would apply to any borrower who overextended. I dialed Patricia's number. Prepare the formal restructuring offer. I'll sign it tonight. Tomorrow we would extend Richard a reasonable pathway to financial stability. His response would reveal whether he sought resolution or destruction. Either way, I would be prepared. Richard's response to the loan restructuring offer arrived with predictable swiftness. A terse email rejecting all terms, copied to his Westfield attorneys. What followed was a week of escalating legal maneuvers, document requests, depositions of bank officers, investigations into historical board decisions. He's burning through cash on legal fees, Harrison reported during our daily briefing. Westfield doesn't come cheap. I nodded, reviewing the latest financial analysis. And the lakeside property? Listed yesterday. Well below market value. He needs a quick sale. The dominoes were falling exactly as expected, Richard's financial position deteriorating as he focused on wresting control rather than stabilizing his finances. His desperation was becoming evident to others beyond our immediate circle. The Regional Banking Association called, Patricia added. They've heard rumors about a leadership dispute at Montgomery Financial. Several board members have received inquiries. The moment had arrived to shift from defense to decisive action, a power move that would end the war before it damaged the institution irreparably. I reached for the folder I'd prepared the night before. Implement Protocol 23. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Are you certain? Once triggered? It can't be reversed for 90 days, I finished. Yes, I'm certain. Protocol 23, one of James's most ingenious corporate governance provisions. In the event of a contested leadership situation, it temporarily froze all non-standard transactions, required unanimous board approval for any executive changes, and most importantly, placed all related party loans under direct regulatory supervision. Richards. Loans would now be subject to independent oversight, removing any appearance of personal vendetta on my part. Standards would be enforced by regulatory mandate, not maternal discipline. By evening, the mechanism was activated through proper channels. I waited in Elizabeth's garden, watching the sun set behind carefully trimmed hedges. My phone remained silent until precisely 8:17 p.m. What the hell did you do? Richard's voice crackled with barely controlled fury. Protected the bank, I replied calmly. Protocol 23 is a governance safeguard designed for exactly this situation. Leadership disputes that threaten institutional stability. You've frozen everything. The regulators are reviewing all my loans. Not just yours. All related party transactions. I kept my voice measured. Standard procedure during governance challenges. This is about the retirement community, isn't it? Some twisted revenge because we suggested you needed assistance? This is about banking, Richard. Something your father understood implicitly. The institution comes before personal convenience. Always. The silence stretched between us before he spoke again, voice lowered. The lakeside property sale falls through if I can't modify the existing loan. You know that. Then perhaps it's time to consider the restructuring offer you rejected. Another silence, heavier than before. The terms are punitive. The terms are standard. The same any borrower would receive in similar circumstances. After he hung up, I called Harrison. Begin preparations for Phase 2. Richard will either accept terms within 48 hours or escalate further. Either way, we proceed as planned. The power move was complete, not an emotional reaction but a strategic recalibration. Richard had wanted war. I had given him regulation instead. James would have approved. The Montgomery Financial boardroom had always projected understated power. Mahogany paneling, leather chairs, subtle lighting that highlighted the portraits of past chairmen, including James. I arrived 30 minutes early for the emergency board meeting, reviewing documents with Harrison and Patricia while we waited. All board members have confirmed attendance, Harrison noted, including those Richard attempted to sway to his position. The door opened precisely at 10:02 a.m. Board members filed in silently, followed by Richard and a gray-haired man I recognized as Walter Westfield himself, a signal of how seriously they were taking this confrontation. Richard's appearance shocked me. In just 2 weeks, he seemed to have aged years, strain evident in the shadows beneath his eyes, the tightness around his mouth. His customary bespoke suit hung slightly loose, as if he'd lost weight rapidly. "Thank you all for coming," I began once everyone was seated. "I've called this meeting to address the governance challenges facing Montgomery Financial and to propose a resolution that protects all stakeholders." Walter Westfield leaned forward. "Before we proceed, Mrs. Montgomery, my client wishes to present evidence of irregular decision-making during your husband's illness, decisions that potentially compromised shareholder value and violated fiduciary duty." "By all means," I replied calmly. Richard distributed bound presentations to each board member. These documents demonstrate a pattern of unilateral decisions made between 2008 and 2010, when my father was incapacitated. Decisions that diverted resources from planned succession to alternative investments. I waited until he finished before responding. Those alternative investments, particularly the Westlake acquisition, generated 32% returns during the financial crisis, while comparable institutions posted substantial losses. Every decision is documented with supporting analysis and unanimous executive committee approval. "Executive committee members reporting directly to you," Westfield countered. "To the board," I corrected, "which ratified all decisions upon review, as confirmed by your predecessor firm during the 2011 governance audit." Richard's expression faltered slightly. He hadn't expected me to know about the audit, conducted confidentially after James's recovery and filed in sealed records. I opened my portfolio and removed a single document. "I'd like to address the underlying issue directly. This is a comprehensive loan restructuring proposal for all Montgomery Premier Properties holdings. Standard terms, industry-appropriate interest rates, reasonable payment schedules." "We've already rejected," Richard began. "This isn't negotiable," I interrupted. "The regulatory review triggered by Protocol 23 has classified your loans as special mention status. Either accept restructuring or face mandatory remediation." The board members shifted uncomfortably, understanding the implications. Special mention status was one step away from substandard, a classification that would require public disclosure and potential foreclosure. Richard stared at the document, then at me. "You've systematically undermined my business, challenged my authority, and now threaten my properties," Why? Because I suggested you needed assisted living? No, Richard, because you violated banking fundamentals your father established. Because you treated Montgomery Financial as a personal resource rather than a public trust. Because you believed entitlement trumped qualification. The silence that followed was profound. You have 24 hours to accept the restructuring. Terms, I concluded. After that, regulatory protocol requires we proceed with remediation. As board members filed out, Richard remained seated, the restructuring document untouched before him. You're my mother, he said finally, voice barely audible. Yes, I replied. Which is why the terms offer salvation rather than destruction, something no other lender would provide in your circumstances. He looked up, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in years. I never knew you. Not really. No, I agreed quietly. You never asked. 3 weeks after the board confrontation, I sat in Elizabeth's sunroom reviewing the quarterly reports. Richard had ultimately accepted the restructuring terms. Survival, instinct overriding pride. The lakeside property sale proceeded at reduced value, providing enough liquidity to stabilize his immediate financial position. Our communication remained strictly professional, limited to necessary banking matters. The personal breach remained unaddressed, perhaps permanently. Some fractures couldn't be mended with financial solutions. The board approved your governance recommendations, Harrison reported during our morning call, including the succession planning committee. And Richard's position? Maintained, but with enhanced oversight. The luxury lending division remains under probationary status for 6 months. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. And the quarterly projections? Strong. Market confidence has stabilized since we resolved the governance questions. After ending the call, I walked through Elizabeth's gardens, finding unexpected peace among the methodically arranged plantings. My future had once seemed predetermined. Retirement in the guest house, gradual fading into background family presence, eventual management by concerned relatives who saw only my age, not my capabilities. Now I was reconstructing that future according to my own design. The real estate agent called as I reached the rose garden. Mrs. Montgomery, I've found a property you might appreciate. Historic craftsman on Lakeview Drive, walking distance to downtown. Private but not isolated. Send the details, I replied. I'll review them this afternoon. Independence, financial, residential, personal, was no longer negotiable. Whatever relationship Richard and I might salvage would be built on mutual respect rather than proximity or dependence. My phone chimed with a message from an unexpected source. Vanessa. Max has been asking about you. Would you consider having lunch with him next week? Just the two of you. My grandson, 7 years old, innocent of adult complexities, yet inevitably affected by them. I thought carefully before responding. Tuesday. At Westlake Bistro would be lovely. Noon? Reconstruction didn't mean abandoning every connection, only redefining them on healthier terms. Max deserved a grandmother who modeled dignity and self-respect, not accommodation at any cost. As I returned to the pool house, I noticed new buds forming on Elizabeth's hydrangea bushes, resilient growth following careful pruning. Nature understood the necessity of strategic reduction for renewed vitality. So did I. 1 year after leaving Richard's guest house, I stood in the study of my craftsman home on Lakeview Drive, arranging the last of my relocated belongings. The brass nameplate, Eleanor Montgomery, Executive Vice President, now rested on my personal desk beside family photographs and the small collection of antique banking memorabilia James and I had gathered over decades. The doorbell chimed, precisely at 4 o'clock. Max waited on the porch, a small gift bag clutched in his hands, Richard standing awkwardly behind him. Grandma. Max wrapped his arms around my waist. Dad said we can stay for dinner if that's okay. I met Richard's gaze over our grandson's head. After months of carefully negotiated Tuesday lunches and weekend outings with Max, this was Richard's first visit to my new home. "Of course it's okay," I replied, ushering them inside. While Max explored the garden, Richard examined the framed photographs in my living room. James and me on our wedding day, the three of us at his college graduation, the bank's opening ceremony. "The loans are current," he said finally, his version of an olive branch. "All properties stabilized under the restructuring terms." "I know," I replied. "I still review the reports." He nodded, hands in pockets. The succession committee approved my continuing as division head, with conditions. Appropriate conditions, I hope. A slight smile flickered across his face, the first I'd seen in over a year. "Very appropriate. Regular portfolio reviews, enhanced risk assessment protocols, quarterly performance evaluations." "Banking fundamentals," I observed. "Dad's fundamentals," he acknowledged. "The ones I should have respected from the beginning." We stood in comfortable silence, watching Max through the window as he examined a butterfly bush with serious concentration. "I found a box of Dad's old notes in my office," Richard said. "Handwritten lending guidelines, first-time homebuyer recommendations, small business loan structures." He hesitated. "And letters about me, his concerns about my approach to banking, his hopes for my development." Our eyes met, understanding passing between us. James had seen the potential problems long before they manifested. "He was right," Richard admitted. "About the risks I was taking. About the standards I was ignoring." Another pause. "About how much I still had to learn from you." I turned toward the kitchen. "Help me with dinner? Max likes pasta." Richard followed, accepting the unspoken invitation, not to full reconciliation perhaps, but to something new. Something built on respect rather than obligation. The banking executive in me recognized a solid beginning. The mother in me welcomed it. Legacy, after all, wasn't just about financial inheritance. It was about values transmitted, lessons learned, wisdom finally acknowledged, even when that acknowledgement came later than hoped. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.